just strikes me that when you and I talk about the state of the world economy, I sit in London, you sit in California, we both talk about a sort of doomsday scenario. Maybe we're missing one particular point, and that is if we were watching this in Beijing, Shanghai, Delhi, or a whole host of other cities in the emerging economy world, we'd be saying these guys are way too pessimistic, because overall growth across the world this year is going to be between, I think, 3 and 4% growth. You know, not a contraction, but real growth in many parts of the world. Can that continue if we're right about what's happening in the industrialized world?
So first, we live in a multi-speed growth world where the emerging markets, because of their own efforts, are doing much better. But if we're sitting in these countries, we'd be saying two things, not one. Yes, we'd be saying, hey, look at us. We're doing fine. We have lots of growth. We have a middle class that is getting richer. We have a production. We have employment, etc. But we'd say something else. We live in a global system. And at the core of this global system is the US and Europe. And the US and Europe are having difficulties. So we would also be worried, not because our internals are problematic, they're not, but because we're part of a system where the core is contaminated. And therefore we worry about how does that system operate.
But, you know, in 2008, we had that massive sense of crisis in the West, but within a year, we saw China restored to growth of almost 10%, India 8 or 9%. Why are you so insistent that they cannot insulate themselves from what's happening now?
Two reasons. First, in 2008, everything stopped. There was what's called a sudden stop, and that brought in a lot of fiscal stimulus. Today, we do not have the scope for fiscal stimulus. Today, we have a sovereign debt crisis that has been the impact, the outcome of what we did in 08. So the first thing is we have a lot less fiscal firepower. The second thing is we have a lot less monetary firepower. Interest rates are almost at zero. Central banks have been doing incredibly unconventional things with no assurance that it works. So we have fewer spare tires, if you like, on this car that is on a bumpy journey to an uncertain destination.
You caused a real stir recently by saying, unlike most big financiers and Wall Street players in the United States, saying that actually the message coming from Occupy Wall Street, the fundamental rejection of many of the values of aggressive capitalism that we've seen, you said that was a message that everybody in the United States needed to listen to and to heed and think carefully about. Why did you say that?
Because whenever I look around the world, there are social movements. It's not just in the US, it is in Britain, it is in Spain, it is in Italy, it's in the Arab world. It's all over. And the reason why is because we've had an incredible increase in income and wealth inequality. And no system can operate well when there's a sense that it is not fair. And right now, the perception is the system is not fair. In particular, the system privatized massive gains in the run-up to the 2008 crisis and then socialized massive losses. These losses were socialized on the promise that this was needed for growth and employment, and neither has materialized at any scale that is sufficient. So we have a perception that the system is unfair, and we have to deal with that perception rather than ignore it, because the more we ignore it, the more that social discontent will increase.
I want to be clear about what you're saying. You're saying that you, Mohamed El-Erian, now have concluded that capitalism in its current guise in the United States and Western Europe is unfair and unsustainable. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I think we were on, if you like, a motorway where we lifted the speed limits without realizing that the vehicles that are on this motorway cannot drive at that speed. And therefore, we have to recalibrate the whole motorway if we are to avoid accidents. And I think that there's a recognition that we went too far. We went too far in this great age. Great not in the sense of wonderful, great in the sense of too far. This great age of credit, of debt, and of credit entitlement. And now we have to deal with the consequences.
I can't help wondering what your clients make of this new message coming from you. You deal with some of the richest individuals and corporate clients in the world. They pay you to look after their money and maximize their return. Your most famous fund is your Total Return Fund, which you say, by and large, can deliver profits for your clients in good times and bad. Are you suggesting that you've been part of a fundamentally flawed system? Are you going to stop doing what you've been doing for the last few years?
Now, we operate in this system. So we said, given the system, we operate, and what we aim to do is deliver returns and manage risk. And we do this because people trust us with their pensions, with their retirement funds, with their investments. Now, in doing so, we take a view on what is likely to happen. And we invest on the basis of what's likely to happen. We also discuss what should happen. We don't invest on the basis of what should happen because we don't control outcomes. We are part of this global system. So you've been asking me about what should happen, and we invest on the basis of what's likely to happen. In a perfect world, the two converge, but we don't kid ourselves. We don't have that power. Okay, that power lies in the hands of the policymakers, and we just operate like everybody else in a world that we must understand in order to navigate well for our clients.
Well, a final quick thought then. I began by asking you about pressure. Let me end by asking about control. Do you feel more helpless today doing your job than you've ever felt before?
I feel that every morning something will happen that will disrupt markets and we're going to have to react to. I feel that we're living in a world that's incredibly volatile, a world full of unthinkables. You know, we used to keep a list of unthinkables. Now we just do it every quarter because there's been so many unthinkables. So we live in a very uncertain world. We live in a very unsettled world, but that is the reality that we all are living in today.
Mohamed El-Erian, the only certainty is we have to end there, but thank you very much indeed for joining us from California.
Thank you.
In the United Kingdom, the number of people out of work has hit a 15-year high. 2.6 million Britons are now unemployed, and the number of young jobless has soared to an all-time high of more than 1 million. Until now, the UK job market had been fairly resilient compared with those of neighbouring European economies. One day, I promise we will bring you good economic news, but I'm afraid it is not going to be today. The gloomy outlook comes now from Britain, where the government forecast even lower levels of growth than expected. As a result, Britain needs to borrow more than predicted, according to the Finance Minister, George Osborne. Mr Osborne also warned that Britain risks getting dragged back into recession if the Eurozone debt crisis is not resolved. Meanwhile, here in the United States, the parent company of American Airlines is filing for bankruptcy protection. The biggest walkout in a generation. That's what labour unions are claiming in Britain today. Millions of public sector workers joined the nationwide strike to protest the government's big spending cuts. It's a scene we've seen played out right across the industrialised world this year as workers feel the pain of austerity measures. The BBC's Naomi Grimley has more on the walkout and the economic fight.
It's the biggest strike for a generation. Huge protests wound their way through major cities, not just in London, but in Leeds, Birmingham and Cardiff too. Those involved are unhappy they're being asked to work for longer while paying more towards their pensions. And they say the government isn't listening.
I'm just sick of the government lies about these gold-plated pensions and being overpaid and underworked, and the government can't dip into our future to pay for their black holes.
Do you think the government will take notice? I think there'll be more and more strikes. I just don't think it's going to, you know what? They just don't seem to get it.
Anyone with the flight connection this way, please?
Despite the numbers out on the streets, ports and airports seem to be functioning well. But hospitals in England saw over 5,000 operations cancelled or delayed. The opposition Labour Party says it doesn't support the strike. But even so, inside the House of Commons, there were rowdy exchanges about whose fault it was.
I don't want to see any strikes. I don't want to see schools closed. I don't want to see problems at our borders. But this government has to make responsible decisions.
800,000 low-paid part-time workers, 90% of whom are women, will be paying more, and he denies it. But it is true, Mr. Speaker.
So what exactly is the government proposing? Well, ministers say to balance the books, most public sector workers must put aside 3% more for their pensions. The retirement age will have to rise to 66 by 2020, and pensions will be based on a career average, not a final salary. Polls suggest there's a degree of public support for those striking, but such is the disruption that could change. And there was certainly little sympathy from business leaders.
These sorts of strikes aren't victimless crimes around the country either. We know of loads of small businesses where parents are missing out on a day's work, and of course those companies are missing out on their labour, their productivity. We know of suppliers to the public sector whose businesses have been disrupted. So there are knock-on effects well on into other areas of the economy.
This strike comes just a day after the government announced economic growth was far lower than expected. The age of austerity, it seems, will stalk Britain for longer than originally thought. And that could mean much more public sector strife in the future. Naomi Grimley, BBC News.
And of course we have seen those scenes right across Europe, Athens, Madrid, all people taking to the streets in those countries as well. Well, as people took to the streets in London today, the central bankers of the most powerful countries took to their tool chest in an attempt once again to stop the European debt crisis from causing even more pain. They've joined forces to make more money available to banks, so those banks in turn can lend to businesses and consumers. The news sent stock markets soaring today, but how successful will it be in the longer term? For answers, we turn to the BBC's Michelle Fleury in New York. Michelle, can I start by asking you how close we were to the kind of credit crisis we saw back in 2008 that the central banks decided they had to take this action?
Well, I think we'll never be entirely sure how close we came, whether this was because they saw it already starting to happen, or whether they're acting preemptively because they can see that possibility looming very large in front of them. One thing that we do know from all of this is clearly the danger was close enough to persuade the central banks to act together. What we're already hearing, though, is some people are saying that while this addresses the problem of liquidity, it doesn't necessarily do much more than that. It doesn't solve the debt problems facing Europe at the moment. And that was something mentioned by the governor of the Bank of Japan speaking to the press after these moves were made. And it's certainly the feeling amongst many analysts.
OK, but in the short term, it does seem, looking at market reaction, the Dow went up almost 500 points today, that markets at least think that the imminent crisis of a credit crunch has been solved.
Yes, I mean, what we've done essentially is seen that the central banks have bought the banks some more time, because what had started to happen was that, look, everyone has become convinced that the Eurozone crisis is moving into a sort of deadlier phase at the moment. So you're starting to see investors in particular kind of trying to reduce their exposure to the problems in Europe, reduce their exposure to banks. What that meant in practical terms is that many of these European banks in particular had had difficulty in getting enough dollars. And so over the last month, this problem had been getting more and more acute. The European Central Bank, in fact, had sort of had to get as much as $552 million extra dollars from the Federal Reserve here in the US to try and satisfy that demand. Now we're seeing obviously further moves to try and make dollars more available to these banks so that they can meet their obligations and avoid the kind of credit crisis we saw only a few short years ago.
Michelle, you mentioned it right at the beginning when I was speaking to you, and we're dealing with two separate problems really, aren't we? We're dealing with the short-term problem of not enough credit being available, but the longer-term problem of too much credit having been available in the past.
And that's going to be sort of the challenge lying ahead. I think what we've seen today is that the central banks have bought time. The question now is what is done with that time. All eyes are turning to a meeting on December the 9th amongst European leaders. There's increasing pressure, I would say, on them to try and sort of come up with a plan. Obviously, that's sort of the big concern now, is what can be done. Certainly, talking to investors here in the US, they would like to see the European Central Bank play a greater role in this crisis, possibly buying up the bonds of troubled countries like Italy and Spain, something that so far it's been reluctant to do.
OK, Michelle Fleury there in New York. Michelle, thanks so much for joining us with that. Well, as the world's economic leaders try every trick left to spark growth, for a few lucky countries, these have actually been boom times. One of them is Brazil. Well, as the world's economic leaders try every trick left to spark growth, for a few lucky countries, these have actually been boom times. One of them is Brazil. It was 10 years ago this week that a Goldman Sachs economist lumped the country together with Russia, India and China as newly developing economies, and the acronym BRIC was born. A decade later, the BBC's Justin Rolat has travelled to Brazil to see how far it's come.
How things change. 40 years ago, Brazil was a net importer of food. Now, it's an agricultural superpower.
Brazil have the capacity to feed everyone in the world.
Everyone in the world?
Yes.
A modest ambition?
Yes.
Because Brazil leads the world in soya, doesn't it?
The second in products.
Second in soya.
First in coffee, first in sugarcane.
First in orange juice.
Orange juice. First in cacao.
Beef.
Beef.
You're not just the bread basket, you're the whole grocery store. But Brazil didn't put the B into BRICS on the basis of agriculture alone. It has vast reserves of iron ore and countless other minerals, and recently struck oil too. But the real game changer for Brazil lies the other side of the world from the country's modernist capital. The key is the high price of commodities, and that's down to the rapid industrialization of fellow BRICS, China and India.
Brazilian and Chinese economies are very complementary. Brazil needs capital to create jobs in Brazil and to grow its economy. China needs the strategic resources for its sustained growth and to feed its people that countries such as Brazil can provide.
But this vision of economic harmony isn't apparent to most Brazilians. Cheap Chinese imports are squeezing out local products because the commodity boom has driven the real, Brazil's currency, through the roof. Blairo Maggi is one of Brazil's biggest soya farmers and now an influential senator with, say insiders, presidential ambitions.
Acho que se nós, mais uma vez, se nós não tomarmos cuidado,
I think if we're not careful, China will eat us, and after that, India will come too. So how is Brazil going to compete with Chinese industry? Unless the Brazilian government takes adequate measures to protect us, Brazilian heavy machinery is going to disappear.
For the moment, though, Brazil continues to grow 3.5% this year, and growth is perhaps the most powerful argument for the BRICS grouping, because the BRICS nations represent the fastest growing large economies in an otherwise stagnating world. Justin Rolat, BBC News, Brazil.